Hello, everybody. We are starting our new novel today, Patty Reed's Doll. So we are going to start. We're just going to take a quick look at the map at the beginning of the book where you can see the route that they traveled from here across the country over to here. Here is also a picture of the actual doll. And then you can see some other pictures, and then there's the table of contents, and then there's also a list of illustrations. The back of the book says, in the winter of 1846, a group of pioneers known as the Donner Party was stranded by heavy snow in the Sierra Nevada mountains. They endured bitter hardship while trapped for months without food, unable to continue their westward journey to California. Many of them died in the struggle, but certain ones survived, including 8-year-old Patty Reed, a little girl filled with dignity and determination in the face of mortal danger. Patty had a special friend throughout this ordeal, a tiny wooden doll she kept hidden in her dress. This book is Patty's story, seen through the eyes of her beloved dolly. Stored in the doll's wooden head are vivid memories of their fateful journey, beginning at their home in Springfield, Illinois. Dolly remembers the days out on the blossoming prairies. They were like one long picnic, and nights around the campfire where they sang and danced and told stories. She recalls the colorful ceremonies of Indian tribes they encountered on the way, and later, the dusty, tiresome trek through the desert. During the bleak winter months, when they were snowbound in the mountains, Dolly was Patty's only comfort. Today, Dolly sits in a glass case at Sutter's Fort State Historic Park in Sacramento, California. The children come from near and far to visit her. The story of Patty Reed and her little wooden doll gives us a good picture of the true life experiences of real pioneer children. It is skillfully pieced together from authentic letters, journals, and reminiscence of Donner Party survivors. It is also the heartwarming tale of how a little girl's love for her precious doll can transcend all danger. So this story, this novel, is based on real life. It's not 100% nonfiction, but it is based on a real story. So Chapter 1, Springfield, Illinois, 1846. I am a little wooden doll with a painted face and a knob of painted hair on top of my wooden head. My cheeks are not so rosy as they once were, nor is my hair so glossy black. But is it any wonder? I was a pioneer, and the trials I have been through would change the face of almost any doll. I remember well when first I heard of pioneering in covered wagons, Indians and wilderness trails. It was in Grandma's big bedroom back in Springfield, Illinois, on the long winter evenings of 1845. We sat in our rocking chairs, Puss and Patty and I, toasting our toes by the warm fire in the grate and coaxing Grandma to tell us her stories. Grandma sat propped up with flouncy pillows in her high four-poster bed, a knitted shawl around her shoulders, and her thin gray curls tucked into a white nightcap. She was ailing and frail, for she was very old, but her talk was as lively as ever as she told the tales we loved to hear about her childhood in Kentucky. For Grandma had been a pioneer. She had traveled with her folks over the wilderness trail, Boone's Path, she called it, following the blazed trees that Daniel Boone himself had marked along the narrow, rocky road across the Cumberland Mountains from Virginia to the canebrakes of Kentucky. All sorts of things she told us about pioneering. There were creeks to cross with ugly steep banks, she said. Our hands were blistered from clinging to the tree roots and vines as we clambered up the slopes, and our legs were scratched by briars and thorn bushes. The trail zigzagged up the mountains along narrow ledges, and we could look down through the blue haze and see the green valleys far below. This made us eager to go ahead, for one of those green valleys was to be our new home. At night, we heard the scary cries of wild animals, and always we were on the lookout for the painted faces of Indians peering through the brush. They would creep like bears through the long grass. All of a sudden, arrows would rain from nowhere, but before we could catch sight of the redskins, they had melted into the woods again. We kept right close to the wagons, I can tell you. We didn't fancy the notion of our scalps being tied to some wild Indian's belt. At last, sunburned and leg-weary, we came to the valley where the settlements were. It looked mighty pretty to us, with the trees leafing out and the wind smelling sweet with wild apple blossoms. Father and the other men took our claims and commenced to clear the land. They worked from sun-up to sundown, chopping trees and grubbing out shrubs and bushes so the corn could be planted before summer. Men were hardy in those days, my dears. Their arms were strong and their axes sharp. Grandma lay back on her pillows, and her dark eyes had a faraway look in them, as though she were back in Kentucky, helping her father and the corn in the fresh plowed furrows of their new clearing. Patty and Puss eagerly begged for more, and Grandma went on to tell of fearsome Indian fights and escapes, and how one of their neighbors was killed while searching for his plow horse after it had strayed into the woods, and how her aunt had been spirited away while she was gathering wild strawberries and kept as a slave for 5 long years in the Indian village away to the north. As Grandma related this story, Patty's black eyes grew bigger and blacker than ever. She gripped me tightly in her hand and kept peeping over her shoulder as though the eerie shadows cast by the flames were really lurking savages ready to pounce upon us. By the time Grandma had finished her tale, we were almost too scared to scamper off to bed. Once there, Patty cuddled me close under the covers, whispering to me not to be afraid, for she would keep me safe from the Indians. But I think she was the one who was frightened the most, and it was I who, nestling up close, reassured her. After hearing such stories of pioneers and Indians, imagine how we felt to be told that we were to become pioneers. One morning after breakfast, Patty came hurrying up to her room, and standing before the window seat where her family of dolls was sitting, she breathlessly disclosed the news. Papa says we are all going to be pioneers across the plains to California. It will be a healthier place for Mother, and lots of other people are going in the spring with wagons and oxen and everything for keeping house. Isn't it exciting? And you shall all have new outfits for the journey, and a little hair trunk to pack your best clothes in. I'll have my name put on it with nail heads, Patty Reed, and then no wild Indian would dare to steal it, seeing it belongs to me. We only hope the Indians would understand it that way. As Patty buzzed away to talk it over with Grandma, I tried to explain to the other dolls just how this piece of news might affect us, for I knew what pioneering was from having heard Grandma's stories. They were not too pleased at the prospect. Rosalie opened her blue eyes and complained, "Oh dear, I can't believe I shall like being a pioneer doll. My new velvet cloak and sprigged muslin gown may get mud-stained and dusty. How dreadful to think of leaving this nice clean window seat to travel in a wagon." Here is the picture of Patty up in her room, in her grandmother's room, listening to the stories with the cat and the doll. Minnie, the wooden doll who was inclined to be of a jealous nature, and was always snubbing me because I was only 4 inches tall, remarked acidly, "Pioneering may be fine for you. You're used to being knocked about. After all, you are just the little country cousin." She had heard Patty herself make that last remark, but I knew Patty didn't mean it that way. Minnie thought she did. Patty loved me best of all her dolls, and she said I was their little country cousin only because my clothes were not so fine as theirs. Patty herself made them for me while Grandma sewed their elegant outfits. Patty could not manage her needle quite well enough to do the fine sewing that Grandma did. So while their dresses had beautiful tucks and ruffles and fine feather stitching, my dress was usually a little square with a hole for my head and sewed together with a few awkward stitches and tied around the middle with a bit of ribbon sash. But I did not envy my sister dolls their elegance. The gentle touch of Patty's fingers as she carefully bent my wooden joints and pulled the new frock over my painted head and then proudly held me up for Grandma to see made me very happy because I was her little friend. Besides, she spent more time with me than with the others. I was just the right size to ride around in her apron pocket, and thus I came to know much more than they about family doings, and Patty and I shared a secret world all of our own. If Patty was going pioneering, I wanted to go too, and I guess the others would feel the same way if it came to a choice between riding in a wagon or being left on some dark closet shelf as Puss's dolls were. She was 14 and had forgotten her doll family for a long time now. She had a pony named Billy, and we were used to look down from our window seat into the yard below and see her ride out the gate with her father. We wondered if the time would come when we, too, would be gathering our dust on the closet shelf while Patty rode out with the grown-ups. But that time had not come yet. Patty was only 8, and so far she would rather sit and sew at Grandma's bedside, run with messages downstairs to her mother or Eliza in the kitchen, or play with her little brothers Tommy and Jimmy, always with me in her apron pocket. Yes, if there was any dust to be gathered, I much preferred to gather it out on the trail with Patty than on the shelf in a dark closet. I was present in Patty's apron pocket when the family gathered around Grandma's bed that afternoon to talk over the pioneering venture with her. Mr. and Mrs. Reed, Patty's father and mother, plainly did not think that Grandma would be able to go with them, and they gently tried to explain how Uncle Gershom, Grandma's eldest son, and his wife would come to live in the big white house that we should be leaving, and that Grandma would stay right where she was in her comfortable bed, and they would take good care of her. The old lady sat up bright and sudden at the thought of this. "Now you listen here, James Fraser Reed," I heard her say. "You're not taking daughter Margaret and these grandchildren of mine one step of the way west unless I go along. I guess I know a heap more about pioneering than you do, and I'm not a fixin' to be left behind." Well, they did a bit more pleading with her, but in the end she got her way, and I must say that I for one was glad to know that we were to have such an experienced pioneer as Grandma with us on our dangerous journey through the Indian country. During the next few weeks, I kept my ears open to pick up bits of information to relay to my sister dolls, who were gradually becoming reconciled to the thought of the journey. I told them that I had heard Mrs. Reed say there were others from Springfield going west in April. 2 families by the name of Donner, friends of the Reeds, who had several children Patty's and Puss's age, and some little ones like Tommy and Jimmy. In their Saturday night reading club, they had been reading a book about California by a Mr. Hastings, who said that there was so much sunshine that chills and fever and aching bones were unknown. The land was rich and good for several crops a year, and the Americans who were settled out there said there was room for many more. The mothers did not think much of the idea at first, but as the cold Illinois winter dragged on and Patty's mother had so many headaches and miseries, she was at last persuaded that life would be much better in California. And once she made up her mind to go, the Donner mothers decided to go too. It wasn't long after the winter snows melted that the activities began in the yard below. While Grandma and Mrs. Reed did great quantities of sewing indoors, preparations of a different sort were going on outside. We dolls, looking down from our seat at the upstairs window, judged that it must be a very long way to California by the amount of activity we saw. One day, two enormous wagons were drawn into the yard. Box after box of food was stowed away in them by Milt Elliott and Bayless Williams, the two hired men who were going with us. Big, good-natured Eliza Williams, our cook, was Bayless's sister, and she was going too. Other men were going to help drive the oxen and take care of the cattle. They were all down in the yard below us, packing the wagons and shouting remarks at one another. Mr. Reed stood by checking things off his long list as they were hoisted into the wagon. Barrels of flour, cornmeal and sugar, rice, beans, peas, crackers, dried fruit, preserves, honey, vinegar, salt, hams, beef, and smoked fish. We dolls had no idea that people required so much food. Then there were other lists for Patty's father to check. Tools of all sorts. Axes, hatchets, sickles to cut the grass on long drives, I hear him say to Milt. Spades, saws, nails, whetstones, tacks, needles, pins, thread, scissors, wax, sail needles, twine, hammers, rope, chains, beeswax, and tallow melted together for greasing shoes, rosin and tallow for wheels, guns and bullet molds, and bars of lead to make the bullets. Oh dear, we were called. That's in case of the Indian attacks. From time to time, other men who, we gathered, were taking their families to California, stopped by to see how the Reeds were coming along. You'd better plan to sell some of your horses and buy oxen, we heard Mr. Reed tell one of them. Horses are likely to stall in mud holes, you know, and oxen can live off the grass on the way. Packing feed for the horses will take up too much of your wagon space. Hadn't thought of it in that way, the man said. Guess you're right, Mr. Reed. One morning another stranger-looking wagon was drawn up in the yard. This must be the one we had heard the family refer to as the palace car. Mr. Reed was having it built especially comfortable for Grandma. It's to be our house on wheels, Patty told us. See, the door is on the side instead of at the end like the other wagons, and there are spring seats inside and a little iron stove to keep us warm. There's the stovepipe going up through the top with a piece of tin around it to keep the sparks from falling on the canvas top. And just look, it has 2 stories. Isn't that funny? A wagon with an upstairs and beds, a regular traveling house. Bedding and cooking utensils and clothes in big canvas sacks were put into the palace car. The Reeds didn't take any trunks. They are useless weight, Patty's father said, but we dolls had our little hair trunk, as Patty promised, and although it contained mainly the fashionable gowns of my sister dolls, I too had a few scraps tucked away in it, from which Patty had promised to make a new dress as we traveled. At last the day came for departure. It was the 14th of April, 1846. As I have heard Patty relate many times since then, the birds were singing in the lilac bushes outside our window, and spring flowers were blossoming in the yard of the big white house that we were leaving forever. Patty and Puss were dressed in their new linsey traveling suits, and I was safely cradled in Patty's pocket. Mr. Reed was dignified and handsome in black broadcloth, and Mrs. Reed was wearing her best Paisley shawl and Sunday bonnet. The men led teams of oxen into the yard and yoked them to the wagons. Mr. Reed's mare, Glaucus, was pawing the ground, and Puss's pony Billy was prancing about as excited as his mistress. Relatives and neighbors were gathered to bid the Reeds good-bye. Here, Margaret, we heard one lady say to Mrs. Reed, I brought you a looking-glass. Hang it where you can take a peep at yourself now and then, so you won't forget to keep your good looks. Patty's mother laughingly thanked her and hung it opposite the door in the palace car. Soon there was great barking of dogs and shouting as more wagons rolled up the road. Someone called out, Here are the Donners! Patty was arranging us in the palace car by this time, and several other little girls popped their heads in to see what was going on. "Oh, are you allowed to take all your dolls?" one of them asked Patty. "We could only take our best ones. We had to give the old ones away." I heard this remark with dismay. Dear me, I thought, is it possible Patty might have to leave me behind? But I was soon reassured as she answered, "We have plenty of room for everything, and I wouldn't give any of my dolls away for anything." Her little hand closed around me and made me feel warm and secure. Never had we been in the midst of so many laughing and chattering and crying people. All of Patty's and Puss's schoolmates were there to kiss them goodbye. "What luck, kids," one little boy remarked. "I wish my folks were going to California." Uncle James and Uncle Gershom still tried to persuade Grandma to change her mind and remain with them as they lifted her onto the feather bed in the palace car. But Grandma was as determined as ever to go a-pioneering once again. At last the drivers, one by one, cracked their whips, and the oxen moved their wagons slowly out onto the road. Patty sat on Grandma's bed, holding up the wagon flap so we could all have one last look at our old home and cheering, waving friends as we were leaving behind. Through the streets of Springfield, Milt Elliott drove the palace car. "Milt," I heard Puss call out as she rode by on Billy, "are you sure you can get the oxen to keep the wagon on that narrow bridge? Without reins, how can you make them go where you want them to?" Milt laughed and called back, "Don't you worry, Puss. Boley and George are the best pair of lead oxen in the party. They know what whoa and haw and gee mean as well as I do." Several of the family dogs were going with us, and they pranced proudly alongside the wagons, paying not the least attention as curious Springfield dogs came up to bark and sniff as we rolled by. "Are you comfortable, Grandma?" Patty asked. "Fine, child, fine," answered the old woman, her eyes sparkling. I suppose she was remembering when she was Patty's age and starting on that other trek down the wilderness road, the one which she had told us of so often. Jimmy and Tommy busied themselves inspecting the cupboards under the seats, pulling on the knobs and squatting down to peer into them inquisitively, and repeating 100 times, "What's this, Mommy? What's this?" "We won't travel far today, Mother," Mrs. Reed said to Grandma. "The men intend to set up camp just as they will when we get out on the plains. Besides, Jimmy and Gershom and some of the Donners' friends plan to ride out and camp with us for a farewell party tonight. Yes, they don't like the idea of their old mother a-goin' pioneering at her age. But you know, I'll be happier with you, dear, as long as I last. How many of us are there, daughter?" 31, I believe, Mr. Reed said. "A good number for three families. The Donners are fine folks, quiet and sensible. They have some nice youngsters, too. Ours won't lack playmates. Mrs. George Donner plans to start a school in California. With 14 young ones in the party, it will be a lively crossing, I reckon." And that is the end of chapter 1. And there's the picture of everybody waving goodbye to them.